Cheryl like this. I'll now stop. Stop moving. So this is just something that's been my experience, is what I've specialized in for the last 20 some years, working with folks outside of here who've experienced trauma. And then when I came here, I noticed that many of the issues they didn't come with me, but they were here also. And so since then, Michelle and I have studied it. We've come to terms with the reality that, at least in our program, the numbers of students who've experienced trauma is massive compared to the national average. And we can kind of guess it might be similar to some of the other areas at LCSC, being a smaller local college. And so my goal has been to then, how do I change my class to meet their needs? And so I'm just going to briefly go over this. Some of these slides I might actually skip because a lot of you probably know a lot of this, but there is a large prevalence of childhood trauma among everybody. So 71% of children are exposed to violence each year, either in home or out of home. 3 million children are maltreated or neglected each year. 3.5 to 10 million children witness violence against their mothers each year. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before adulthood. So it's a fairly common experience that we don't often talk about. So you can assume the numbers of students who come to college is pretty much the same. I'm trying to figure out how to move your faces around so I can see. I can't. I'll figure it out. I'll be helped here.
Do you want to just minimize that? I think we can do that.
Sorry, we got 2 Mac users here. So even between the 2 of us, it's hard. So also looking at college students, a recent survey of 14,000 students found that 1 in 3 college freshmen reported dealing with mental illness in the years leading to college. Same year, different survey, 48,000 college students participated, reported that anxiety and depression were among the biggest factors that negatively affected their academic performance. 67% of women and 54% of men had felt very lonely. Overall, 42% of students said they had felt so depressed in the past year that they could not function. So these are the folks that are in college. In the system of people who are in the mental health system, so seeking counseling, 84% have histories of trauma. 50% of males or females and 25% of males in mental health experience sexual assault in childhood.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Is that reported? Is there some sense that some of the incidences, that the numbers are the people who have reported it as opposed to the unreported?
Oh yeah, there's, we presume that a lot of this is unreported because it's so, our society is so shame-based that even in the mental health clinic, people sometimes can take years to report it. So we can't, it's not likely people reporting it that it didn't happen, but the opposite could be true. So in the trauma field, we've kind of gone from going to the medical model is what's wrong with you. You go in, you get a diagnosis, you have a mental illness. That's what we treat. We give you medication for that. So we look at what's happened to you instead. But most recently, we're looking at what's right about you. So what is there about you that we need to keep in our programs? What are you doing well with? So just briefly, some of the things that people who've experienced trauma have difficulty in terms of academics is paying attention and learning. You'll see them out of the classroom more often, increased isolation, more absences, increased risk of failing grades. Specific learning disabilities that they have are ability to read verbal and non-verbal cues of the instructor or their peers, ability to process oral and written information. It's very difficult for people who have experienced trauma. They have difficulty with sequential organization, lots of memory issues, difficulties understanding cause and effect relationships. Their sense of self and perspective taking of others is not quite what it should be. In other words, like if somebody says something to me, I might take it wrong. I don't have a perspective of what they're feeling or thinking. Identification and differentiation of emotions is very difficult. They may feel numb and act as if they don't care. Using language to relate to people is difficult for them. Understanding mental states and feelings of others is very difficult. So a lot of these things make school and education also difficult. So one of the issues with trauma and like complex trauma, I kind of skipped those slides, but complex trauma is traumas that you experience repeatedly. So if you experienced a hurricane, that would be called an acute trauma, so a one-time event. And dealing with that, the diagnosis and the treatment for that is very different than complex trauma. So childhood abuse is an example of complex trauma where every single day is kind of the same. And that really is what causes these changes in the memory, these changes in the mind, how that the brain is actually changed. Other long-term complex trauma could be interpersonal violence. If someone's in a very violent relationship for year on year after year, being in a war zone for a long time also causes the same thing. Unfortunately, in our society, this has been a battle. This diagnosis of complex trauma is not recognized by the APA. So that means most physicians and mental health therapists who use the APA, called the DSM, the big book, to diagnose people, this is not an option for diagnoses. So somebody cannot be diagnosed with complex trauma. They do often get diagnosed with PTSD, so that's an acute trauma, but it's doesn't really allow them the treatment that they need. But it also doesn't allow disability centers to diagnose somebody and say they have this disability because it's not a diagnosis. Recently, in recent years, the ICD, so that's the international big book that gives you all the diagnoses, does now include complex trauma. So I have met students on campus who have that diagnoses from somebody who happens to be using the ICD. I wasn't able to find out, but I think Idaho still uses the ICD now, so that's a fairly recent change. So Idaho, if you're on Medicaid, you can get a diagnosis of complex trauma, but most counselors in the area don't use that. So, so from a personal standpoint, my question is, do I need the student to go to disability services to get these accommodations, yes or no? Because they can't, they don't qualify for them anyway. Or am I willing to accommodate students just because they need it? So I'll throw that as a question. What are your thoughts in terms of accommodating students? Do they need the paperwork from a disabilities?
In my experience, we'll definitely know, but when they do come into my classes with accommodations, it's usually stuff that wouldn't apply to my class, like extra test time. Well, I don't give tests, or I need to record lectures. Well, I don't do a lot of lecturing, or sorry, hands-on or whatever. And so to me, it's like, I don't know what to do with that. I end up accommodating in other ways anyway,
Yeah.
even though they have the piece of paper.
We're going to discuss later what are the accommodations and why some of the accommodations don't help anyway in this situation. Any other thoughts on accommodations in the classroom?
Well, I've only recently learned that we don't necessarily need the paper. I was kind of instructed you should tell everyone they need to bring the paper to class. And then I was having a conversation with Anna, and she's like, well, if you've worked with a student before, you don't have to have them get the paper. But this, actually, I'm, kind of shocked because I don't know, where I got the idea that, you have to have it in writing, but I've always kind of encouraged students to do that. And obviously it's helpful if they have, that, but I find it actually very helpful to know that as an instructor, it's not necessarily my obligation to make them.
No, and that's a good question. That came up the last training I did here, is that some of the teachers were quite surprised and happy to find out when they asked about accommodations and they asked me what they could do. I said, you can do anything you want to. You can accommodate every student in your room in different manners that you see fit without the approval. So that's good to know that there's no law that says that we can't make everything equitable to students and provide them what they each need in the classroom without the paper. I tell my students, because maybe I'm lazy, I don't like getting all the paperwork, I basically toss it. And I just tell them, if you need to go take, I don't give tests either, but if you need to go take the test somewhere else, I don't care. If you want to come to my office, I don't care. If you need more time on your paper, just let me know. So I don't track the accommodations, except to the extent that I provide everyone with the exact same accommodations, regardless of who they are. And I don't need a doctor's note. These are all adults. If they tell me they have an issue, I'm not going to.
The one thing about the accommodations paperwork for me, it's helpful because then I know that if they're absent, then it's because maybe they have to go to a doctor or that kind of thing. And so it helps me in the context of attendance, and tracking attendance.
And that's something to consider too, is these are all kind of belief systems. When I work in the trauma field, there's still people out there who call it trauma drama. They don't believe in it. They believe in the incident, but they don't believe that it affects the brain. And these are some of the counselors in town, so they still believe that it was in the past, get over it. So a lot of this, what I'm talking about today, and when I go out and give trainings, it's also a belief system. So I recognize I'm talking to people who might have a completely different belief than I do, and that's okay. So feel free to disagree with everything if you want to. Lots of people do. So when I think what is my primary goal with any student? For me, I want my students to have learned the material that I presented to them. For me, I don't care how they do it. I don't really care what my accommodations are. If at the end they've actually learned it, that's my goal. So we're going to look at, or think about what are some of your goals for your student? What's your end goal for them? And what kind of things do you want to do to make that happen? So if you're curious about other trauma supported environments, what are some of the basics that we look at? We won't get to all these today, but these are the 6 main components of a trauma informed space. So safety is a primary issue. And by safety, we mean, not physical safety, although that's an issue for some of our students who have a lot of safety concerns in that way, but also safety and trusting you, feeling that they're going to come into your classroom and that a success is an actual possibility for them. So they want to feel safe. Trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, and gender issues being recognized. So those are all things that I look at in my classroom to make sure I'm trying my best. And even, after this year, I know some things next year I'm already going to change. So as I said, in this case, so safety means maximizing control over their own lives. So that might be a different definition of safety than we look at. It's just, do I have control over my day? Do I get to decide what happens to me? Do I get to decide what I do? Am I in charge of my own success? So this comes from an adult learner standpoint. So looking at our students as adults. So a learner-centered theory has been implemented in education settings with the hopes of fostering conducive mentoring between educators and students. So simplistically, does the student have control over their own education, or is it 100% teacher driven? So what control are we providing our adults that are in our classroom with in terms of what they're learning, how they're learning it, how they're presenting their learning it? So the learning center theories are good ones to kind of keep on board. Do you balance the classroom between the teacher and the student? Is there a power differential? So we look at opportunities for voice, choice, revision, and redemption. So that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. Are these things that you think are beneficial to students? Are these things that you already do in your classroom? Or are some of these things that you could include in your classroom? And if you've been a long-term teacher, some of these things are very difficult for people to change. Like most things are difficult to change. So voice. People who've experienced trauma, control is the #1 issue that they deal with in therapy. People control them in a way that they didn't want them to, and that becomes their lifelong struggle, is to get that control back, for better or for worse. And that will show up in your students in the classroom. So providing them that voice, showing them that they do have control over everything, their life, their education. So what ways do students have a voice in determining what they learn and how they demonstrate this learning? So these are just a couple of examples. Allow democratic votes on materials to be covered. I said policies be analyzed, social injustices, because that's one thing we do in my class, but whatever fits your classes. In what way are they given choice on what they're learning? Requesting feedback throughout the semester. I asked for suggestions on materials presented on Canvas. I put a lot of materials on Canvas, way more than they need or could do in a week. And many of the students do all of it. Some of them don't. It doesn't matter. It's just extra stuff for them for my face-to-face classes. And so I always ask them, is there something else you'd like to learn about? I'm happy to put that material on Canvas. And so I'll, throughout the semester, get stuff that they mention or talk about, and I'll put that in the next week on Canvas so they can learn more about it. Other ways that you can think of in some of your classrooms that you provide them with their own voice.
I did a talking exercise today because we came back from spring break, and sometimes just letting them talk. So I had them meet in pairs, almost like speed dating. And I just threw out all different words, both words that are in their material, but also things like, what do you do over spring break? Like very safe things, but then also, big things, because we're starting to talk about identity and microaggressions and But they could talk about anything, class material, they could bring in personal examples, but they could also say pass or pause and not talk, and it was just a minute. So they just have to talk for a minute, and some of the bigger things like microaggression, I'll just do 30 seconds, but really there's no pressure and well, there's pressure, but I mean,
Yeah.
it gives them an opportunity to have voice, I guess, and to just talk and kind of get us brainstorming, and I call it yoga for the brain.
Yeah.
And it gets us back, because I don't know about you, but after spring break, I just need to get recentered on where were we, and also helps me hear kind of what has stuck out and what are they bringing back to the
Yeah.
table. So I don't know, it works pretty well. They like it.
Comes up a lot in the readings on trauma is you take 5 minutes or maybe even more for students to just talk. You know, they've got so much on their mind, they've been isolated from other students, they come to your classroom, here's 20 people, and they're not allowed to talk about it, about anything about their day. They just have to get right to work and then leave again, back to the isolation. So just giving a classroom 5 minutes at the beginning to chat about anything, just to release some of that internal emotion and stress that they have before you get started, it makes an amazing difference on how they respond to the class.
That is one of the things that I do in my senior classes is right from the very beginning, we have, check-in time. How are you doing? What's happening? Anything to report, and sometimes I have to like prompt them. But they seem to find it useful.
Yeah, because they're going to walk into the classroom with lots of emotions. Doesn't mean they're going to talk about those emotions,
Mhm.
just that they get a chance to speak, be heard about anything.
Well,
But it's-
Rachel says she gives choice of assignments and due dates. I should maybe pull the chat up so we
Okay.
can see that.
Feel free to just turn
I'm
on your,
figuring out my
yeah,
technology
feel free,
stuff, so.
those online, just turn on your microphone and start talking. There's just a very handful of us here, so. But yeah, there's ways to make choices and assignments. Well, the next one's actually choice after voice, so these obviously overlap. But yeah, do students have a voice in the classroom?
And I think safety comes into that play too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because I mean, they're always chatting before my thing. Oh, Christina, you know this, blah, blah, blah. And then I get questions and yeah, so we talk no matter what, first 5 to 15 minutes of class.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they can learn if they're already thinking about other things. So
Yeah.
we might as well just get every question answered at that moment and then move on with our day. It
Yeah.
seems to work pretty well.
I do the internships and then people like Luella, her next class is trash because they're all worried about it and talking about it. Whoever the junior teachers are going to the next class and are just like, sorry.
That's good though.
That's
Yeah,
good. I
I
mean,
think it's good. And the nice thing is that's a groups class. So,
Yeah.
to be able to integrate that processing as part of the teaching is also
Yeah.
too, so.
So I mean, it's pretty normal that we walk into a space and want to talk. Choice. So as Rachel said, you've got some choices on assignments. Are there alternative assignments for assessment? And sometimes this stresses teachers out, and I understand why. It means coming up with alternative assignments maybe. But I found in my own classes, just having a variety of opportunities for smaller assignments throughout has the same mathematical effect on it. So if they blow one, and we'll talk a little later, what happens when you blow something, it doesn't destroy their grade for the whole semester. So there are other ways to make the class safer. And if you don't want to give different assignments or allow them to do that, there are other ways to mathematically make it safer for them. Allow students to choose the topic for their project or paper. I have always done that. I guess I'm lazy probably. But I'm still surprised that students are surprised. That, they told us what to write about. It's like, oh no. I mean, I tell them like, this is your diversity paper, write about that. So I tell them in that sense, obviously there's a general topic, but so that's, that one's a pretty easy one to do. Let them pick the topic. Allow students to choose the format. So this one you might have to think a little harder about. That means, should it be an oral presentation, a podcast, a written paper? Do you have other ways to present something for students who struggle with one form? And keep in mind, these folks who have trauma, who have experienced trauma, have been told by society that there's nothing wrong with them. They most likely will not come into your classroom and tell you they have a problem because they don't even know it. They've been told, this is just who you are. You don't have a problem, just deal with it. So these students often will never tell you what the issue is. So you don't really know who needs to be accommodated or not, which is why I just accommodate everybody. Revisit your assessments and their alignment to your learning goals. If for this example, if oral presentations are not part of your learning goal, do you need to require a public speaking event in a large group? You know, unless you're actually teaching them speaking practices, which I have an assignment that does that. It may not be the best assessment for every student, so you can give them a choice on how to express that knowledge. Allow students to choose one of several topics of discussion, learning in a class when possible, meaning, you know, do you let them decide what the discussion is for today, those kind of things. So other things that you guys do that provide them with choices.
I was just, I mean, while you're talking, I have like their final presentation for their final research. I've always just had a PowerPoint presentation, and last couple of years I've been doing an infographic, and then they can choose one or the other. And the infographics have been amazing, but only maybe 3 will try that. And so this year I actually was like, took away the PowerPoint, left no choice, and was like, do an infographic, you know, but it makes me wonder, like, was that safe and familiar, you know? And so, and by the end of the year was just that their capacity, that's all they had, was to put something on. So it just made me think about, should I put that back in, or challenge, you know, because on the other hand, you want them to challenge, and as social workers, we have to communicate with stakeholders about, you know, nonprofits and, you know, research and how we're doing and stuff. And yeah, so, you know, weighing like what's a learning outcome that I want them to have versus like meeting them where they're at, you know?
Yeah, my final, they have to stand up and give a presentation, but it's also a lot about how it's presented, saying that if you're in an agency and you have a client and then you decide to move agencies, you're going to go to what's called a staffing, and you're going to explain this client to somebody else. So that's all it is, folks. You're just sitting at a table, telling everybody else about your clients. A lot of it's also in the presentation, not you're going to come and give a presentation today, you know, wear your best clothing. Just the you know, the way you present it to them can scare the living daylights out of them, you know. And so it's also in the, you know, presentation. We do a debate each year for the seniors, but it's not a debate. I say, if you go down to the city council and you got an idea you want to present to them, that's what you're doing. It's just two sides of the table chatting with each other. I don't do the 10 minutes for you and the 5 minutes for you. They just, which is stressful for them, because I just say, go. One of them has to start talking, but it's very comfortable for them, and they know that I'll interact with them. I'll occasionally have a comment, usually to keep them back on, you know, track or something. But I make the setting very informal, exact same skill that they can give a verbal presentation. They do a really good job, but I make the setting very informal and impress on them. Try to give examples. This would be, you know, city council is formal, but not like stand in front of 2,000 people and do a debate. So a lot of it's just the mindset that you create for them to help them relax and feel safe, that this is just, you guys are just going to chat back and forth. You know, if you do it well, I can't grade you on it, because some of you talk more than the others. I can't really grade that. You know, you'll get your grade because you've done all the work. And this is your chance to practice what's it like to express that opinion in front of people that are going to argue back with you. Because that's a hugely scary thing for people in trauma, is to have people disagree with you. And then to have the teacher allow them to do that is also a dangerous thing. It's like, well, think of dodgeball. That was my big thing in school. Because I have a fairly large trauma background. It's like my teacher allowed all those kids to hurt me, and that was a huge problem for me to accept that. So also think about, what is their perception of you in terms of keeping them safe? Are you going to set them up so that people on the other side of the table can argue with them and tell them they're, you know, I tell them kind of, no, we're going to do this, but it's going to be informal, and I'm going to be here, and I'm at the city council too. I'll participate if I see things getting off track. So a lot of it's, you know, do you present yourself as a safe person? Have you given them a safe thing to do? Or are you presenting yourself as somebody who gives them an unsafe thing and tells them they have to do that? So that's probably more for the PE teachers than us, but it's still something to consider, is that we don't always think of doing those things as unsafe. And we don't think of ourselves as, I'm the one who made them do the unsafe thing, and how they feel about us afterwards.
Well, going back to your infographic thing, and also having smaller assignments kind of throughout the course, can you introduce that as a requirement for a smaller assignment first? You know, I do that because we do reading responses each week, but I don't want to spend 15 weeks just reading little essay, you know, paragraph things. So we start with that. Then I have them do a concept map one week. Then I have them do a handout And then I say, okay, now you have your choice of the 3 or whatever to do. And so at least I know that they've experienced all 3 or 4 different ways, because they might find something they do like.
Yeah.
But then at the end, it's like, yes, you want to stick with PowerPoint or whatever it might be. At least I know that I've given them more options, upfront beforehand.
They've been exposed.
Yeah.
Nice, I like that. And I, like you, Lauren, I've got a class this semester where my students had a choice to make how they were going to contribute to a group project, and they found it very stressful that I wasn't telling them, you
Yeah,
should
yeah.
do this particular thing. And I thought I had like framed why I was doing it that way well, but it clearly didn't quite connect.
Yeah.
So I think, that idea about at least letting them know that I was safe and the space
Yeah,
was
yeah.
safe, I hope helped for
Yeah.
some of them.
And sometimes that's a learning that you can help them find. Like for my students, they need to know that I'm safe. So I usually try and find some way to get them to my office and have a chat with them, before their paper's late or before something bad happens, so they can learn it's perfectly okay. But they need that, and they need it several times in their life before they believe that other people are safer than what they grew up with. But yeah, I have a lot of those students, they just come because they've never had the opportunity to control their life before. They've never done it, literally never done it. And so they'll be the ones in my office. And yeah, I help them come up with, and show them how to come up with their own ideas, show them that they have their own ideas, because they don't think they have any ideas. They don't have any self-respect for their own thoughts. They don't think they have any good thoughts. And so a lot of it's just that teaching them, you have some great thoughts, tell me what they are, and then tell them it's okay to go do that with your classmates in this assignment. It's a perfectly intelligent thing to do. So yeah, when you do these things, you'll notice them kind of pop out of the wall, the ones that are surprised and don't know how to do it. And then that's your chance to teach them, how do you come up with your own idea?
I call it productive struggle.
Yeah, productive struggle.
It's productive struggle times.
Yeah, because you'll notice and you think, oh, I can't, that's too irritating, I can't do that again. It's like, no, what you did was you noticed exactly what they needed to learn and who needed to learn it. It's like, this is how you learn that you are smart and you have some really good ideas. Because most of these students a lot of these students will just sit in the back row and think they're too stupid to participate. And so that's one of their major learning goals is, can you convince them that they're smart and that they've got a lot to offer? And that, some of these students, and we know in the social work program, you can see it 2 years, takes 2 years, and they finally kind of come around. So it's a time, you're putting your time into them. So revision is another one, and this is, I could have gone on for hours on this one. And there's tons of information about revision, what does it, most people who've had experienced trauma in their childhood are still experiencing it now. It doesn't go away because you decided to change your life, your family's still attached to you, and it follows them. Our students have not just a crisis every 5 years, but once a month, each one of them is going to have a crisis. And how do we help them continue through school and get past your classes? So one of the major drawbacks for our students in our program is when they try and get through a class that only has like 2 or 3 major assignments, and if you fail one, you drop the class and you start over again. We've had students take the same class 2 or 3 times because of that. So one of the major things when you look at trauma work in curriculum is that class can't have a single make it or break it assignment. One assignment that if you fail, you're done. They're going to have a crisis that week or the week after. It's just a given. They will have a crisis every single semester. And they need to do this simultaneously with those crises. They need to get through college at the same time. And so that's one of the things to look at. What I took apart all my classes was to break them up, like Chris was saying, in lots of tiny assignments. And I did all the math over and over again, made sure if they blew one thing, they could still pass the class. Obviously there's, the end of the road for anybody, but, nothing was a make it or break it assignment. Everything was doable. But revision's a good thing, interesting thing to look at for yourself. Do you allow people to redo an assignment that they failed? Any thoughts on that and off the top of your head?
One of the things that I'm doing this semester in the macro class, because these are seniors and they need a B or better to leave, right? So if they're not getting a B on those assignments, you get a do-over, because anything less than a B is not, it can be a hindrance, and I don't want anyone to have an 8 or to have to fail it, so.
The rewrite, you know, like I would love it if every single student would rewrite their papers and I give them, you know, feedback so
Yeah.
that they know what to do, because I think that's where the learning happens.
Lauren, I was just curious, like, can you tell us about like how students take feedback? Like who are in complex trauma spaces?
Well, that's a scary, dangerous thing too, is to get feedback, because in the past, feedback just meant a really horrible negative consequence was coming after it. The kind of, I call it the wait till your dad gets home syndrome, that it just causes horrible fear in them to see feedback. So a lot of even though I'm on Canvas, I will often print off the papers for them and do a handwritten so that I can sit down with them and discuss it with them. So it comes across better than what they might see online. We do a lot of work in the classroom with each other, just chatting about typical problems that everybody has, trying to get them comfortable, normalizing that their experience is very normal, the mistakes they make is very normal, it's not the end of the world. And I try and also normalize this concept of revision. And this, I think all of us have a problem with. It's like we want to do the perfect, our first paper has to be perfect, right? You want the idea that it's not bothers everybody, I think. But to normalize that too, is that getting better takes practice, which then naturally, and a lot of the, some of the, I put some quotes in here, but like, if you're an Olympic runner and the race you won today and got the gold medal, they don't average it with last week's score because, you don't get to do it twice unless we average it with your bad score. I mean, things like that don't happen in the real world. You are what you are today, and you practice. You do the same thing over and over and over again before you learn it. But often in academics, that's not how it goes. The teacher tells you what it is, tells you how to do it, and then your first assessment needs to be perfect. There's really no practicing. So I try and integrate the practicing into the classroom physically, and to encourage them that you should want to rewrite it. You should want to practice it. And I want you to practice it, and I want you to give me drafts. And if you don't like your grade, let's talk about it. I don't let the people who get the A- rewrite their papers. That's also an issue. And so I sit down, because every semester I have somebody picking out online classes, the first quiz, why did I miss that one point? And that's another response to trauma, is they've learned that people hurt them. So now they're coming to college and they're going to fight back, and that's great. But I want them to relax. And so I get them on, if they're out of town, I get them on a Zoom meeting. I say, let's talk about how many points there are in class. There's 1,000 points in the class, and you missed one point. And I just use humor and say, you don't need to stress about this, because when you're about 2/3 of the way through the semester, if you don't like your grade, then let's get together then and go back and see, was it the 1 point on the quiz? What was it that, but, go ahead and relax and try and show them you can relax in my classroom. And then at some point in time towards the end, if you don't like your grade, then let's sit down and figure out how to adjust it. But I don't want you to stress out, because they're horribly afraid of every single grade that comes back. So it is, to me, it's important to meet them face to face and discuss what the grade meant. Is it a big deal? Is it not a big deal? If it is a big deal, then what can you do to revise this and make up for it? But, there's lots of classes that, there is no revision. There is no making up for anything. I tell my students, because I've got Chris and Michelle here, I say, people talk about, we got to teach about the real world. Say, in my real world, when I screw up, what happens? They both say, oh, what can we do to help you? I've never had my pay docked. Haven't been fired yet. Life has some natural due dates. I've written some grants. The grant people aren't going to ask for, me to help me. But for the most part, all the paperwork I do has always been forgiven when it was late. So I don't know in the real world where these kind of things happen, where, and I think I said in here, you pay for a product. They paid me $1,000 for the class, and I don't give them the end product because they didn't meet my expectations. I don't go buy a car and have them take the car away because I didn't meet their expectations. I don't, go to the hairdresser and have her only cut half of it, and then I didn't meet her expectations. So this is the only place I've ever worked where I can take the product back from the person who's already paid for me, not give them their money back, and not give them a product. So to me, there's also an internal ethical issue that I have of taking people's money. Well, I don't really get it, but I get some of it. Taking people's money and then not giving them a product and blaming it on them, which in this setting in academia, we've been doing for hundreds of years. But it does seem like a weird thing to do, but that's kind of another topic for another day. But it doesn't meet well with people who've experienced trauma, because their whole life is about negative consequences and people taking things from them and hurting them because they didn't meet the standards. They weren't a good enough child. And so it just is a really bad thing for people in trauma to experience this kind of environment. And so it is something to think about in classes. Are we punishing them or are we teaching them something? One of the quotes on here is, lawyers who finally pass the bar exam on their second or third attempt are not limited to practicing law only on Tuesdays. So you don't know what lawyers out there passed it the first time, and you don't know which passed it the fourth time. They're all, society says they're all the same. So it is something to consider in your work. What does it mean to revise? Do you have other revision policies, any of you?
So when I do quizzes and tests, I allow them to have a second attempt if they're not happy with their score. They have to take the first attempt on or before. It gets a little confusing. Once you get the rhythm of it, it makes perfect sense, but they have to take it before the Friday that it's due so that I have time to turn it around. I have to say to them, it's not realistic to think I'm going to be on the computer grading tests at 10 o'clock, an hour before it closes. So you have to have taken that first attempt by that Friday before it's due. And people take advantage. I mean, they really appreciate having a chance to come back to it if they're not happy with their score. At least I think they do.
Yeah.
But that's one of those small ways that I can support. A lot of it for me has been, in terms of my professional development as an educator, is really kind of readjusting my expectations of students. But and I tell them all the time, I'm here, I'm going to get you there, right? You've got some work to do. You've got heavy lifting, but I'm here and I'll support you in whatever way I can, scaffolding my appointments, or my assignments, like much of you have talked about drafting, like I do a draft paper. That I don't do, that's a heavy lifting for me, but it is also because I'm committed to them learning. And I do a lot of, I really struggled at first because I was so detailed in my editorial feedback on their writing, and knowing that people personalize that. Or so really trying to say, writing is a skill. It takes time, it takes practice. This is critical feedback, it's not criticism. So really just trying to frame what they're seeing so that they understand that it's not me attacking them as a human being, but more about me just saying, your writing needs some work and we're here. And the thing that I really appreciated, I've been here now long enough where I'm like seeing a cohort that I started with, they're graduating, and the writing is just improved so much in the context of social work in the profession and the course concepts and being able to discuss them and articulate their understanding, right? So yeah, I mean, it's really, not unlike the rest of you. It's like, what do you need from me? And how can I help you? How can I get you there?
I think it's really hard for them to improve their writing if they don't have
do it,
those
yeah.
chances to, if you're always starting from scratch every time, you're missing out on this opportunity. So I love seeing a revised paper. So great.
I think you touched on something, Marlo, too. Just, I don't think a lot of students, when they think revision, they think grammar and spelling. And I've actually just spent time now talking about why it's really about just getting deeper into the thought more so than the flow and the transitions. That's like where a lot of the good writing goes. But I just was almost late to this because I just met with a student and she's like, I have them do these challenges, but they have to post them in the discussion board. And for her, she likes doing the challenging, but just the act of posting them in this open forum is the block. And so the last one, she just didn't do it. And she wrote, I just want to cry. She wrote it in the public forum. And so I met with her and I just said, we can do something different. And she's like, really? Yes. Obviously this assignment's not working for you and you're still doing all of the work but you don't want to post it. That's fine. Let's figure out another way. But I think obviously, working for me, it is like what we're saying is it's me changing the mindset of just talking about it, and I know that I'll adjust and give them, they can do it. This deadline is not a hard deadline. You need more time. It's okay. And I say it, but maybe I'm not saying it enough. Like that safety measure, like how can I say it in different ways? And I have started using with the Canvas. I love the recording feature. It's still feedback, but I think seeing my face, I can just record the feedback,
Yeah.
especially with the ones where they need a little more work and maybe a little make that more gentle, where they
Yeah.
might not see that in the written
Yeah.
feedback. Like, to gently say, hey, this is common, but boy, this needs a lot of work. And how to say that in a nice way, that they can see my face and that I care.
Yeah,
That's been really useful for my online classes, is to have that recording feature.
I want to use that more next year. This is my first
Yeah,
year really having many online classes. I haven't taught them before, so
yeah,
I want to use that more because some of them, I usually would have them come in my office because I knew they was going to cry. So they come in, but I could also use humor. So I'm going to tell you something really awful here. The paper's terrible. I got to do something for you here. But you can't do that in writing. There's no way to get that across in writing, And it's, for people in trauma, and trauma it's not a learning disability. They're quite smart. Chris and I worked in a program with kids for, I don't know how long you were there, 15 years, but they were all quite smart. They were in a special program because they weren't special ed. They just had empty spaces in their education, but they come across as being learning disabled because there's so many things they can't do. But I had one person this semester was, you mean essays can be more than 5 paragraphs? Yes. But in some other classrooms, they might, you might be insulted but people in trauma are still living 10 years ago. They're still living in the 3rd grade. And so this person's last memory of writing was when you teach the 5-paragraph essay, always, I think, until you finally graduate. But so it's important to know that they're going to present as being that, but they're not. And when they do finally get on board, then they're by 2 years later, they're excellent. So it's also about noticing them and showing that they're smart, finding ways to show them, tell them on a video instead of in writing.
I don't know when we're doing Q&A. Can I ask a question?
Sure,
now?
we're always,
So-
well, never mind.
No, I'm like, sorry, I don't have to ask a question now, but I've never had this, but I have several students, and I'm making assumptions, who are coming to class every day and have turned in nothing.
Mhm.
Those are the ones that, that's a real common trauma presentation. I call it autopilot. It's like, if I just keep moving forward, nobody will notice that there's anything wrong. It's like, well, I notice. Those I always ask to come into my office and I try and catch them at the very beginning. I have a little list of things I want to do at the beginning of each semester, and I try and notice them if I can. And then have them just come in and chat and just find out, and then they'll usually start talking about what's going on. And I don't know that you can always help them, but at least I know, and they know. I know that you're there. You're a great student. You say some great things in class. You've got this assignment out, and we have a little classroom next to my office. Say, would you like to come into the classroom and I'll do it with you? And just give them that once. I can do this. Yeah, and I'll sit down and say, yeah, type that. Yeah, and it'll take like 30 minutes to see you're done, and it's great. It's perfect. So it's really about me just trying to notice those people who are just on autopilot. And they show up or they stop showing up. They were doing great and they just vaporized on me. But I think it makes a huge difference to them. My first semester here, I did have an online class because the Coeur d'Alene staff I was replacing, so I had to teach that class. And one person vaporized on me, so I didn't know any better, so I called her on the phone. I thought you did that. And her husband picked it up. He goes, "Who are you?" I said, "Her teacher." "Susie, it's your teacher." She gets on the phone. She starts sobbing. "I can't believe you called me." I thought, I'll do this more often because this feels great, actually. Sorry you're sobbing, but I'm happy. I just made somebody's whole day, and we got her back into the class. I said, "No, you can catch up." But it was so simple. Sometimes people say, "Well, you can't work harder than the student." I said, that wasn't very hard work, and it was fun, actually, because she was so excited to not fail that semester and not have to quit the program because she couldn't do it. It was like, so it is hard to contact them. They're designed to not be contacted. They've got huge walls up because they need them. So they're not easy crowd to get to know. It can be super, super hard. But trying to find a safe place to get to know them, so they feel very safe chatting with you and talking to you. To find that time to just sit down and do an assignment with them. So I've done lots of those over the years. Just sit down and say, type that sentence that you just told me, type that down and type that down. and ask one other question, they still answer me, say, type that down. And it does, to me, it is a disability because it's a disability I grew up with and had to deal with. And disabilities take those kind of efforts to get past them. It's not easy to have a disabled person in your classroom. There is no simple way to get all of your lectures to somebody who's hearing impaired or sight impaired. There's no simple way. It will take extra work if you consider this to be a disability and you want to help them overcome it. Because many of those people do autopilot and they're just so scared to death of typing anything on paper. Because I had one student that said in our family, anything on paper, because it was mostly illegal in the house, you had to be very afraid of writing anything down. And so they would just freeze anytime a paper came up because they had to overthink every single word. Can I get caught for this? Is this illegal? Am I saying anything that's wrong? So there's some big problems that they deal with, not simple things. It can be surprising to you and huge. And I don't, they told me that because they told me that. Most students don't tell me why they're totally frozen over assignments. But it's like, yeah, you want to come in and sit down, I'll write one with you. And I'll show you that you are smart and everything you said was fine. And I'm happy to give them full points for that little assignment. See, nothing happened. You did it.
Can I ask a question too, when you have a chance?
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
So I have a larger class this semester of 50, mostly freshmen. And I'd say a fair number of them are actually on the maybe a spectrum of being of having come out of a really difficult couple of years. I probably would label quite a few of them as traumatized by COVID and and some of the things that they kind of went through during that. And I've found some ways to try to make sure that I'm still including things like regrading and tests and et cetera. But maybe it's less that they're traumatized and more just that I'm more acutely aware of them because I'm older and maybe I've taught a little bit longer now and see what they're going through. And it actually starts to be kind of hard. Like I'm good. I'm pretty good at getting them connected to me and commenting and talking with me. But when you start talking about 50 students and half of them need to talk to you for half an hour after their test, this actually ends up being a fair number of hours during the week that I actually don't have time for. And I think I counted one of my weeks after their test of being upwards of 80 hours. It's just kind of, it was a long week of talking with students and trying to connect with them, and yet they so need it. And so I just don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how to balance these things so that it can be more efficient, maybe. But each of the students really needs something different right now. The 50-person model is really hard, but I think, like you said, it's necessary to get them through. They're doing okay, but it's a lot of time.
And I think some of it has to do with, when you're kind of talking about an overall campus issue and not just a classroom issue. When you're teaching gen ed or you're teaching larger classes, it's not just your student, whereas most of my classes are seniors, so I might have 16 students in them and I know them pretty well. But teaching a lower level class or a gen ed class, you've got dozens. And so then it would be, for me, also reaching out to other faculty, trying to spread out the load. Certainly they're in other people's courses. Can other people help them? Can their advisor help them? But that also I've noticed requires that person that I reach out to has the same mindset and thinks that they need and deserve that help, because that doesn't always work. I can, point that out to somebody else, but they don't necessarily get on board with wanting to help them at that level. So that is, that's a campus issue. And I, hope in the future that we get more understanding of the percentage of the amount of trauma that exists within our students. And that, to me, it isn't to me. I don't care about retention personally, but it's my job, I want to keep my job too. And retention is, lingo that we have. So for me, from an administrative viewpoint, it would be an amazing thing to have better understanding of trauma and to have more resources for it, because the retention would be massive. Most of the studies on trauma in college freshmen cannot be done because they drop out the first semester. And so there's no way to research them because they're already gone. So we kind of know from the general numbers that most of the people who have extreme trauma who struggle with college drop out before we can help them, because we don't notice them. And so we can't even research it. So we can only guess that that's happening here also. I've seen it happen in my classes. I've seen people just vaporize and never come back. And I know what their experiences is. So that would, from an administrative standpoint, that would be one fairly, to me, large way to increase retention, is to understand the trauma model and to get more help on board. So it's not just a handful of teachers trying to take 50 kids in a class and help them, because it's impossible to do it that way.
Can I add one? I want to just say one thing that, and I don't do this in every class, but like intro to social work and social welfare in my groups class. In some classes, I use like a weekly reflection journal. It has a point value, right? So they get their points. And even if a person just says, I've had a shitty week, pardon me, right? It's a place and space for them to just talk about how they're doing, how their week is going, how, all of it. And it's interesting because when I first introduced it to my first class, intro to social work and social welfare, they said, you're going to read those? And I said, yes, I am, right? Because it is a place for them to process what's going on, process how they're doing, how they're managing. You can monitor for people's breakdowns, right? I also have to always say though, and I am a clinical social worker. I am a mandated reporter. So if you talk about hurting yourself or someone else, then the confidentiality is waived. But I assure them that it is confidential. It's a safe place for them to just talk about where they're at, what's on their heart. And sometimes I'll have a post and it's linked to the writing or the work for the week, but also sometimes I just say, how are you doing? And it gives them a chance to kind of process. Unless it's really heavy stuff, I don't necessarily respond because it's not a dynamic piece, but it's their opportunity to have their voice and express themselves. And really, I only respond if it's really hard and harsh, and I just validate support. Do you have the support that you need around the death of your grandmother, right? So whatever's going on, I want to make sure they're supported, but it's also a place where I can watch and see how they're progressing. So.
And that is a lot harder in, science and math courses. You don't have quite the outlet for that in those courses. At the same time, science and math is like a trigger for most people in trauma. That's, in their childhood, they were shamed in their science and math classes. So it'd be a great opportunity to help them feel safe, but you're right, it's much more difficult in science and math classes to do those kind of things. They do tend to be larger classes, and you probably won't have a weekly journal in those classes. So it does make it very difficult in that setting to interact with them. And that's, to me, it's important that the whole campus become trauma informed. So you could refer them to other instructors or their advisor and be assured that they would get that help that they need from somebody, that would spread the workload around. But that, for me, that's kind of a next step in the process, is a trauma informing the campus and getting more people on board. So it isn't a few who are overwhelmed with it.
Although if anybody was going to implement a reflection journal, it would be Rachel. So maybe a good.
Yeah, you did it first.
Well,
A chemistry reflection journal might be exactly what should be happening. In the natural
Well,
sciences.
I do have a thing that I actually do it on Google Forms. A check-in every other week or so where I ask those questions, like at just a scale of 0 to 5, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And then I can see really easily on like an Excel document, which sounds really impersonal, but at least I can just see all of them and see if anybody's at a 1. And then if they're at a 1, then I check in with them.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I wish everybody would do that. So the last point was, I don't even know what time it is. I can't see on here.
You've got 3 minutes.
3
but we
minutes.
could-
I'll talk about, failure and shame are just inherent in trauma. That's one of their big issues, is that fear of failure, the fear of more shame. This is why people drop out their first semester. They know they're going to fail, or they believe they're going to fail, so they just drop out. So this is, the group I would like to prevent from dropping out. So, and I can send you this PowerPoint. So I ensure that my class is unfailable. I mean, the only thing they could do to fail it would be to tell me they want to fail it for whatever reason. But it's unfailable because I don't have those single assignments that are make it and break it assignments. There's assignments they can end up not doing at all. And I can, if you want me to, I can show you how to do the math on them. In essence, I almost give too many points, assuming that they're going to bomb something, but not so many points that they can get an A by doing half the work. I mean, so it's very mathematically tight. So they can pass. They can still have a bad week or two and pass the class. More assignments and not less. Do you let them make up assignments? That kind of thing. So always consider, is your class, how easy it is to fail your class? Because we want to show them that you can always come back. My students in their internship, maybe they work with, substance abuse. They say, how many times do you go in and work with the same client who keeps coming back? And I say, does it make a difference? Whether it's them again for the 1,000th time, or is a new person, what difference does it make? You're going to work every day. We don't know which of the one times is the time they're going to make it. So they can keep coming back again and again. Keep doing that paper if you want to. I mean, I'm just sitting here waiting for your papers to come in. That's, up to them. So obviously they could fail my class just by not doing it. But there's nothing in the work itself that will actively crush anybody because it's just so hard or unfixable for them. So it's about, if you believe this is something that needs accommodations, do you believe it's okay for them to fix their mistakes? Because the issue is they will fail. I almost brought you my transcript today, but I didn't have time to dig it out. Back in the dark ages, when you got an incomplete, if you didn't finish it, it just remains an I on your transcript. So my transcript is full of W's and I's to this day. And I wouldn't be here today if there weren't people who didn't accommodate my needs. And so I feel like that's why I do this. I'm here, I'm doing okay. I have a job. I've had a career. I'm okay. I think I'm smart enough. But you wouldn't know that if you looked at my bachelor's degree. It's a nightmare. But there's people who would accommodate me and who would let me redo things and who would, kept working with me. And in those days and age, they didn't know why. They didn't understand. I seemed normal enough. I seemed smart enough. She seemed smart enough. So that, and a lot of people say, well, I don't know who's had trauma in my class. Like, it doesn't matter. That slide's on here somewhere. Whatever you do to help the people with trauma, it will help every single student in your class. So you don't have to identify the people who've had trauma. Just do it for everybody. It will help every single student. So thanks you for coming. Email me if you'd like these slides or something or more information. I put some website addresses here for some of the articles. Any last questions or
No,
2-second
great job.
questions?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. So helpful. I'm like all fired up. Of course, there's only 4 weeks of the semester. I'm like, what can I totally change?
I know, me too. I'm like, I'm going in at 1:30. I'm checking with all of them.
Yeah.
In half an hour.
Yeah. It's been, at least in our program, it's a hugely tough year, very tough.
Yeah.